Hello everybody, and welcome to the second part of my Ikoria limited set review. In this one, we are going to be talking about the rares and mythics, but before I dive in, I do want to remind you that if you enjoy the video, remember to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment if you have any questions or feedback about my card evaluations. I'd love to discuss them with you. Also, if you would like to talk more about Ikoria, be sure to join the Discord server, or Nikolai Bola's community Discord server. There will be a link in the description down below and in the pinned comment. It's free for everybody, and it's really fun to have people there to talk about Ikoria all the time and interact and build decks and things like that. Without further ado, let's get to the pre-card analysis announcements. First up, I'm not going to be giving a grade. I think grades are kind of, they lack nuance, shall we say. And a lot of the time, the cards are going to end up in very similar ranges, like, oh, there will be a bunch of Bs and a bunch of B pluses, but there are a lot of situations where you'd rather take the B over the B plus, and it's giving a card a grade is just going to lead to a lot of feels bads, and it doesn't actually really help people improve, and I feel like talking about the cards is much more effective. And if you have any questions about specific picks, you can ask those in the comment section down below, and I would be happy to talk about them. But I will be giving you a sense of when in the pack you should be taking the card, because I do think that is actually pretty useful, because it helps with signal reading. Like if you get a first pickable card, third pick, maybe that's a signal you should be moving into that color. Additionally, I will say that splashing looks like it's going to be very feasible in this set. There is a cycle of dual lands. The gain lands are back from Khans of Tarkir block, and they are going to be very good for helping you splash. So I think splashing is going to be relatively feasible. There's also a ton of fixing in green. So those are things that I'm going to be keeping in mind when I'm evaluating, especially some of the multicolor cards, which is definitely relevant. And then, yeah, without further ado, let's dive on in. First up, we have Cub Warden. I think Cub Warden is going to be great. One of the cool things about Cub Warden is that the 1/1 lifelinkers are actually really good to mutate onto themselves. So you don't have to go all in on the card that you're mutating the Cub Warden onto. You can actually just mutate the Cub Warden, get the 2 1/1s, and then start mutating onto the cats, so you're not just exposing yourself to removal. That being said, I don't think white decks are really the heavy mutate decks, so Cub Warden isn't like... If you're like a red-white deck, you're not necessarily going to be mutating like everything onto your Cub Warden, but I still think that the card is great. A 4-mana 3/5 lifelink would already be pretty solid, and a 4-mana, if you have like mutate onto something for a 3/5 lifelink with 2 1/1 lifelinkers, is also going to be great. So I think this card is going to be a first pick out of most packs you open it. It's probably better than all the commons in white, and probably better than almost all the uncommons, I'd have to imagine. I don't have all the cards memorized at this point because the set spoiler literally came out yesterday, but I think it's probably better than all the commons and uncommons, and you'd be pretty happy to first pick this card. It looks very nice and goes well with the white go wide theme. There is an inspired charge variant, which means that there's actually multiple. There's an uncommon that gives all your guys +2/+1 as a mutate trigger, and there is a common that gives all your guys +2/+1. So I think going wide could be a thing, and Cub Warden really facilitates that game plan. Definitely a high pick. Next is Drannith Magistrate. Not going to spend a lot of time talking about this one. Basically, a 2-mana 1/3 in limited that is a human. You're not really going to want to play this card in most decks. It's not very good. Though you can play it as a fringe playable, but it's just kind of bad. Lavabrink Venturer is next, and this card is actually quite good. Protection is just a very inherently broken mechanic, and there are a lot of expensive cards running around. It is only protection from half of the cards, but that's still very effective, and you can cater it to what's on the board. One kind of interesting thing is that if your opponent has a mutate creature, they can change its converted mana cost by changing the card that they put on top, like if they mutate onto it again, which is something to keep in mind, so that it might not have protection forever, but I still think it's going to be a very powerful card, and it's going to dodge a lot of relevant card types. I think choosing even is going to be my default, just because I'm, like, off the top of my head, a lot of the removal is even based, and things like the 2-mana deal 3 in red, the 4-mana kill a creature in black, things like that are even, but I think it's definitely going to depend on what creatures are on the board, rather than just generically picking even in a vacuum. Next up is, I think the card is quite good and would probably be a first pick out of most packs. Keep in mind, you can't mutate onto it, because it is a human. Next is Luminous Brunoise. This card is fantastic. It reminds me of Nightmare Shepherd from Theros Beyond Death, the previous set. How can I not remember its name? But I think this card is great. It's like a better version of that, because if the card dies, it doesn't come back as a 1/1. It comes back as the same stats, but with flying. And pretty much, if you can protect Luminous Broodmoth, you're going to win the game. It will be a removal magnet, so keep that in mind. Your opponent's probably not going to be killing your creatures all that much if you have Luminous Broodmoth in play. So what it really works well with is you play Luminous Broodmoth when your opponent's tapped out, and then you can like alpha in a bunch of creatures that aren't tokens, of course. And then if your opponent blocks them, they come back with flying, which is just a strict upgrade, or your opponent takes like 8 damage. So imagine going 2-drop, 3-drop, and then on turn 4 you play Luminous Broodmoth. Not only is it a big threat in its own right, but then you attack all of your creatures in, and your opponent can't really block, so they'll just take 6 damage and then be forced to be in a racing situation if they can't kill the Broodmoth, which is really nice. And you can like hold back a couple on defense, and then they'll get flying. I think this card is just stone cold bomb. Even though it does die to removal, a lot of cards die to removal, so you can't hold that against it too much, though some of the best bombs will be like hexproof and stuff like that, I'm sure. Even though there are some bombs you can't interact with, the fact that you can interact with Luminous Broodmoth doesn't mean it's like a bad card. It's just fantastic. Definitely going to be a slam dunk first pick out of a lot of packs. Next up, we have Mythos of Snapdax. This card is going to range from good to absolutely great, depending on whether or not you have the red-black activation. If you have the red-black activation, this becomes Tragic Arrogance, which is a card from Magic Origins that was actually very good, because you just give your opponent, like, say they have like a 2/2, you get rid of their massive mutate creatures, all their other stuff, and they keep like a 2/2, and like a pacifism that they had, though you can just sacrifice the creature that was under the pacifism, so you're pretty much just leaving them with a tiny creature a lot of the time, and you're going to keep your best creature. Even without the activation ability, you can like set up a board so this is going to be good for you. You can imagine scenarios where you're holding back all of your opponent's creatures with like a 3/6 vigilance, and then your opponent has like 5 creatures in play, and you just wipe out like 3 of them, or your opponent has like 3 creatures in play or something, and you get a little bit of value. That being said, I don't think you're really going to want this card outside of very specific decks, unless you have at least the potential to get the red-black. So if I had this in a white-black deck, I'd make sure I had a couple of the gain lands to help splash the red activation part. And in that case, I think this card is actually going to be good. And I think it is a high pick, because I don't think it's going to be that hard to splash. And I think it's going to be game-winning when you do get it with the 3 colors. And even solid in a lot of situations without that extra upside. Next up is Mythos of Illumina. This one's actually pretty interesting for a rules perspective. I just had to ask some of my friends that know about the rules of Magic in more detail. But basically, when you do create a copy of a creature that has mutate, you will get all of the when this creature mutates stuff from the below the creature and above the creature. So you're going to have to keep track of that somehow, but if you like copy one of your opponent's mutate creatures and then mutate onto it, you're going to get all of the triggers that mutate creature would have gotten from your opponent. So pretty powerful card. Clone effects are generally pretty good in limited, and this one even has extra upside of being able to fight. Again, with this one, you don't need to be able to splash it for it to be a good card, because you can just create a copy of like any permanent on the battlefield, which gives you a lot of flexibility. It can be your opponent's permanent, it can be your permanent, but it's nice to have the upside of being able to like get the bonus ability. So I would probably put a couple of game lands in my deck to splash the ability if I was a green-blue deck or a green-red deck. I would still play this in a blue-black. If I was a blue-green deck or a blue-red deck. Yeah, and I would just still play this in a blue-white or a blue-black deck, but I think it's going to be a little bit of extra upside if you can get the full value out of it. But I still definitely a card you're going to first pick a lot of the time. Next up is Sea Dasher Octopus. This card is very sweet. I think it's going to be quite good. It's a cheap way to trigger your mutate cards, so it works really well with other mutate. It gets you your card back immediately. You can choose a good target for it, or you can like be hitting them with a big creature and or attack them with multiple creatures and then flash this in on whatever doesn't get blocked. Unlike a lot of other mutate creatures, it doesn't trigger every time you mutate. It has a different trigger for when it gets value, but it will trigger your other mutate stuff. So I think it's probably best in a lot of cases to it's going to be ideal to save this and get more value by triggering your other mutate stuff if you have it. Maybe you'll get a bonus 3/3, or you'll make your opponent discard an extra card, things like that. But a lot of the time, you're just going to want to cash this in as early as possible, put it onto an evasive threat, and start hitting them with it. You do want to make sure you can hit them consistently, because if you just pay 2 mana to cantrip, and then your card is brickwalled by like a 3/3 or something like that, like you put it on your 2/2 on turn 3, and then your opponent plays a 3/3, and you're just like, well, I can't do anything now. You want to have a backup plan, or you want to put on an evasive threat or onto a big threat, things like that. But I think Sea Dasher Octopus is definitely going to be a card that you take early, especially because it triggers mutate your other mutate cards so cheaply, and it's going to be a very effective card. Next up is Shark Typhoon, which is an absolutely unbelievable card. You don't like the power isn't in the cast this for 6 and start making a bunch of sharks, though that is kind of a fun upside. What the power of Shark Typhoon, I almost said Sharknado because it's got to be they just must have seen that movie. I mean, I would basically guarantee that they based this on the movie. If they came up with this independent of the movie Shark Tornado or Sharknado, I haven't seen the movie myself, but I mean, this is a tornado of sharks. So what do you got to do? Basically, it's an uncounterable because cycling is an activated ability, so it can't be countered by a counterspell. Uncounterable, flash, threat that cantrips. Like imagine a 5-mana 3/3 flash flyer. It has flying for some reason. 5-mana 3/3 flash flyer can't be countered, draw a card. That can then, later in the game, be much bigger than that. Or in the early game, if you really need to, it can be smaller than that. It's just absolutely insane. One of the best rares I've seen. And I think it's probably one of the best rares in the set. Great finisher for a control deck, great finisher for an aggressive deck, just a great card in general, and one you're going to take early. And you can even splash it. It's going to be a great splash card too, because it does really well in the late game situation. So I think Shark Typhoon is going to be great, very splashable, definitely an early pick, and one that you'll pretty much always play because it's very splashable. Next is a Voracious Great Shark. They really went all in on the sharks here. This one looks just like Jaws. They're just going like, well, this is a big creature in a movie. And I think this is going to be a great card in Limited as well. It reminds me of Torrential Gearhulk in many ways from back in Kaladesh. 5-mana 5/4 that counters something when it comes into play. A lot of the time you're going to want to make sure you get some value out of this. Like 5-mana for a 5/4 isn't good unless you're getting a 2-for-1. The flash definitely means you can sometimes eat creatures in combat, and the counter ability means you can sometimes counter spells. So you're going to want to make sure you get like a 2-for-1 when you cast this a lot of the time. But don't be afraid to just play this as a 5/4 if you have to, because if your opponent knows you have this, like in a game 2 situation where you wreck them with it in game 1, they might not play a spell into it, in which case getting your 5/4 out to start applying pressure can also be really relevant. So don't overhold it, if that makes sense. Don't be like, well, I have to get my 2-for-1. I know I just said you really want to get your 2-for-1, but once your opponent knows you have it, a lot of the time you're not going to get that value anymore, so you're going to want to be swinging in with your 5/4 if your opponent like is wasting their turns doing nothing. But yeah, Voracious Great Shark is a great first pick. Moving on, we have Dirge Bat, another fantastic card. These rares have been very good. Whenever it mutates, you just destroy a creature. It has flash, it has flying. It means you can probably like, if in a lot of matchups, you'll be able to like mutate this in at flash, kill one of their ground creatures, block one of their flyers. It's just going to be very powerful, and it works really. This is the type of card that the Octopus really likes. Because it's another cheap mutate trigger, that type of thing. So if the Octopus gets better with good mutate triggers. So if you have like things like Dirge Bat, or like more common and uncommon based mutate stuff, then you're gonna like things like the Octopus. And Dirge Bat's just a fantastic card. I see myself first picking this most of the time, and it really does reward you for mutating all onto the same creature. You'll get whatever other mutate triggers you have, and then you'll definitely get your card back by killing one of their things. So definitely very powerful. You can even kill Planeswalkers, which is just unreal. And it'll give the creature flying, which is super relevant because it lets it attack very well. Don't be afraid to play this on your turn to make your guy evasive. The flash is more of just an upside ability. I can totally see playing this on your creature on your turn, kill one of their ground blockers, make your big guy flying, and then just attack with a lot of your players. Definitely a great first pick. Next is Extinction Event. This card is actually really sweet. I'm not sure. I'm probably going to be taking this early just so I can build around it, but it's really going to be hard to get too much value out of it. I don't think it's going to be like actually super powerful because it's hard to make your cards better, like avoid this while your opponents don't. It's going to be kind of situational that way. But one really cool interaction is if you have mutate, you can mutate a new creature on top and change the converted mana cost of your creature. So like if you have like a 5-drop, like a mutate creature with a 5-drop on top, and you have Extinction Event, and your opponent has an odd level creature you want to kill, and you have another mutate creature, even if it makes the stats smaller, you can like mutate a 4-drop and put the 4-drop on top, even if it lowers the stat line, so that your Extinction Event will then kill only your opponent's odd number creature, which is pretty cool. Saves your mutate creature. So I think Extinction Event is probably playable for that reason. Just a very funny card, and if you're very behind on board or you're getting run over by tokens, you're going to be able to wreck your opponent potentially, but definitely not like a crazy powerful card. So it's probably like a mid-level pick, and it's more of a fun card than like a super competitive card, even though it does definitely answer the cards that you need to answer. Next is Hunted Nightmare. I'm not a huge fan. A 3-mana 4/5 menace isn't like as good. That it's so good that you're like willing to give your opponent like a death touch creature to just trade with it. Though this having menace makes it less likely that the death touch does an insane amount, and it does have upside if your opponent doesn't have a creature in play. I just think death touch is going to be a really premium ability in this format because there are going to be big creatures running around, and so I'm not keen on giving my opponent that ability. I think it's probably playable still. It's just not a card I'm going to be like ecstatic to first pick. It's probably still like a relatively early pick depending on what archetypes are running around, but I don't think it's going to be like an excellent card. Like if I would probably still pick this like 4th or 5th or something like that, because a 3-mana 4/5 is still massive if you play this on curve. and your opponent like missed on 2-drops or something like that. But I just see a lot of situations where my opponent like mutates onto their creature. Then now they have like a 5/5 death touch I can never block. So I'm gonna start off by probably drastically undervaluing this card compared to like where it actually is. But like I'm not gonna be taking this card very highly, which means I probably won't be playing it very often because it still is probably a pretty good card. Yeah, I've got to pop my ears. Next up is Mythos of Adrock. You just destroy a creature, and it's like weird wording, but basically it's a 3-mana kill spell at instant speed, and if you get the extra colors, then you can kill any non-land permanent. It's just really weird wording, just like trips me out. But I think it's just like going to be great. Obviously, 3-mana kill any creature, pretty easy to cast. Definitely something you're going to splash, and you don't really need the green-white part. Like that's a little bit of extra gravy, but most of the time you're going to be killing creatures with this type of effect anyway. And so I think this card is just a premium first pick. You're going to splash it a lot of the time, and even without the green-white activate ability, it's still a great first pick and things like that. So definitely take those Mythos of Adrock. Next is on to the red cards. Quill Phoenix is a great card. It's just a great flyer. It hits pretty hard, and when you mutate, it means that you're going to get back your 4/4 flyer, even if your creature would die, which protects you from removal, which is pretty excellent. And if you ever mutate another creature onto it, then you'll get another feather. So one play pattern I see with Quill Phoenix is early in the game, you'll mutate it onto a creature, you'll get your feather creature token. Then the Quill Phoenix will come back, and you'll mutate another creature onto the Quill Phoenix to get a feather, and then whatever trigger you would get, and maybe buff the stat line a little bit, but that's not the relevant part. What's relevant is you'll get back another feather, and your Quill Phoenix will come back again if it dies, which is just really good, and I think Quill Phoenix is going to be a great first pick and what I'm happy to play and build around. Next is Luca, Coppercoat Outcast. This card actually looks amazing for constructed, not like power level wise, but it's going to be sweet when your opponent like does the, oh, I have a 1/1 token, I'm going to sacrifice it and get my Emrakul, this is great. I think that's kind of funny. That was immediately what I thought of when I saw Luca, Coppercoat Outcast. Basically, in limited, you're going to be getting a decent amount of value. Like if your deck has a lot of creatures in it, exiling 3 cards is likely to be like the same as draw a card. And it does have a ton of loyalty, so it's probably going to stick around. That being, like, it's not like a game-breaking Planeswalker because it doesn't like protect itself. It doesn't function as removal a lot of the time. But I think it's still going to be a pretty high pick because Planeswalkers are just great. If you can stall the board, which you can generally do if you know you have this card in your deck, you can just like make fewer attacks that are bad for you, like slow the game down, and then play Luca and just grind your opponent out with card advantage. And the -2 definitely can be relevant, but I feel like the +1 is generally where you're going to be sitting at in limited. Sometimes you have like only 1 6-drop in your deck, so if you -2 on your 5-drop, you know you're going to hit it, or you have, but I think you're generally going to want to like minus on your cheapest card and then just hope you flip the best card rather than like, oh, I have a 5-drop, I'm going to get a 6-drop, things like that. I think it's just going to be best to minus on your cheapest card and hope for something great rather than like get rid of your best card. So Luca is definitely going to be a good card. I think the play pattern is generally going to be +1 though, and you're just going to win the game and when the game stalls out, which could definitely happen if you build your deck around it. Next is Mythos of Adrock. This card's great. Dividing 5 damage among any number is really good. You can probably get like an easy 2-for-1 with this. And if you have blue-white, sure, you'll get to make them so they can't block, so you can finish them off. But I think if you're playing this card, you're just going to be killing like 2 cards most of the time, like a 3/3 and a 2/2, things like that. Or you can kill 1 card for 5. This card's great, pretty high, like definitely a first pickable card. If you're playing against the token deck, you can just decimate their board. I really like Mythos of Adrock. Sorry. And I think you don't even need the blue-white, like remotely, for it to be good. If you did have like a red-white aggro deck, I might play like a gain land that had blue just to try and splash it because it is a potent tool for an aggressive deck. But aggressive decks don't want to just make their decks slower by putting in tap lands, so you'd probably only want like 1 or maybe 2, and you wouldn't prioritize them as highly as you would like aggressive creatures and stuff because this card's just going to be great. Because, yeah. Keep in mind you can't target players, but it's still going to be a fantastic card. Next up is Unpredictable Cyclone. This is a really weird one, and I don't know how good it is. Like, you cycle it, and then instead of drawing, you can like play the card and like play a different card, and it's just kind of just a bizarre ability. But it does give you a significant mana discount on your cycling cards. So like, it's hard to say how good it is. Like, you cycle a creature for 1 mana, and then you're going to get like a 3-drop. But I don't know how valuable that is, and I don't think Unpredictable Cyclone is going to be very good as a result. The not knowing is really a key, because like a lot of the cycling creatures are kind of expensive, and so on turn 5 you play this, turn 6 you don't really want to be cycling your 6-drop. You'd rather just either play it or wait until you draw one more land so you can play it, similar with 7-drops. And like, you don't want to cycle your 7-drop on turn 7 just to find a 2-drop, and I don't think it's going to be a very good card. I don't think you should be playing it outside of like, sometimes you'll just really need an extra cycler to trigger your stuff, but this has cycling 2 in that case anyway, so I just don't think it's a high pick or even really particularly playable. Next is Yidaro Wandering Monster, and unlike the Unpredictable Cyclone, this card is amazing. This is just absolutely game-breaking rare. I cannot, like, yeah, this card is fantastic. Take it early, play it often. It has Trample and Haste, so when you play it on turn 7, you're smashing in for, like, infinite damage, pretty much. You can cycle it in the early game, and it shuffles back in, which means that you're going to be able to draw it in the late game when you need it. So even in those horrible cases where you have to cycle your bomb rare, you're like, no, curses! You can get it back later on in the game. And if you find yourself cycling it multiple times, you can even get it back for 2 mana, but generally you're going to cycle this once in the early game, then you're going to draw it again in the late game, cast it, and the game's just going to end because you played a 7 mana 8/8 haste. So I think this card is fantastic. Early pick. I love the design on this card in terms of like it's a cool little cycling payoff. It's a wandering monster, so it'll come back eventually, and definitely a great card and one that you're going to first pick pretty much every time you see it. I mean, unless there's like a foil version of Yidaro. Like Yidaro is just amazing. It's like, yeah, absolutely great. Like the distinction between the different rares isn't super important. Like I don't need to say like, oh, it's the best red rare, because like you're not going to have to pick between the rares. You just need to know, yeah, this card is amazing. You're going to want to first pick it. If you open it in pack 2, maybe you consider switching into red for it. Like it's that good. It's just a game-ending card. I think it's fantastic. Next is Kalisafication. This one's actually really interesting because its applications are you put this on your opponent's creature, tap it so that you can swing in for the win. No, that's not actually how you use it. I should use my platform for good, not for evil. Kalisafication is actually going to be a very powerful card, I think, because it just makes any of your creatures into a game-ending threat. A lot of the time you think, oh, but it taps my creature. My creature can't attack. It's going to be, like, really sad because I won't be able to finish them off. But the thing is you put this on, like, your 1/1 token. Like, your 1/1 token that wasn't doing anything on turn 7 except potentially chump blocking, and then all of a sudden, the rest of the game, you have a game-ending threat. So, like, you don't want to put this on your 4/4s or your 3/3s or things like that. But if you put this on a 1/1 or you put this on like a 3/3 trample or anything with trample, things like that, even though you can get blown out by your opponent having removal, you can't really lose to damage-based removal, so it has to be like pacifism or like black kill spells, things like that. And I think Kalisafication is going to be a high pick. It just +20/+20 is absurd. Just ends the game in one swing. If you put this on a flyer or you can give flying, the game is just going to end. And I think Kalisafication is just a great card. Definitely an early pick and one that'll end a lot of games and feel kind of bad when you lose to it because it's like, well, my red-green deck just doesn't have the tools to deal with a +20/+20. Like certain decks just can't beat this card, and a lot of decks have like 1 or 2 answers maybe. So I think it's going to be a great card. Next up is a Gem Razor. This is kind of cute, like Reclamation Sage Mutate trigger. It's also just a 4-mana 4/4 Reach Trample. So this card's going to be great. There are a decent number of enchantments and artifacts, I think, in the set. Like there's a Pacifism, there's a Capture Spheres, there's things like that you're going to want to be killing, and Gem Razor really does that well. I think it's probably an early pick, but I could see taking some of the premium removal spells over it, just because it is a 4/4, like for 4 baseline kinda, unless you're getting value. So there are some removal spells I could see taking over it, like some of their best uncommons. But overall, Gem Razor is a fantastic card and definitely a early pick, even if it's not like a slam dunk first pick. Though I could definitely see it being a really good card. Next, and if the format ends up having more enchantments than I'm anticipating, then maybe it is a first pick. But and I could see first picking out of a lot of packs, but most, like, there are some cards I would take over it. It's not like, oh, every common and uncommon is worse than this. Next is Coggle, Titan Ape. This card's amazing. 6 mana. You fight their creature, and it's a 7/6, so it's going to be able to kill something. And then when it attacks, you get more value. And if you ever have humans, which you should be able to because you have Coggle, so you're going to build around it a little bit at least and get some humans, you can make it impossible to kill ever. So Coggle is fantastic. Slam dunk, bomb rare, first pick this type of card. Next up is Mythos of Brokest. This card's going to be solid, but I don't think it's going to be an insanely high pick. Only getting permanence makes it more like Regenesis than Once in Future from Throne of Eldraine, because not being able to get like your removal spells back is actually kind of a little bit bad in many cases. That being said, you are going to be able to get a lot of good hits off this, I think, if you can get the activated ability. So I think it's a medium level pick, but once you're in like green-black or green-blue, you're going to want to try your best to splash the activated ability, which shouldn't be too hard because green has a lot of fixing. And then once you can splash the bonus ability, I think you're going to be pretty happy with this card because you can tutor out your best creature for the situation. So I think the card is probably a relatively high pick still because it's going to be pretty easy to splash in green, and you can splash the bonus part if you are green blue or green black, which is a decent subset of green decks, half of them to be precise. And I think the value is going to be pretty nice as well, getting back some permanents if you have gotten 2 for 1. Now, there's also a good amount of self-mill in green and green-black in particular. Next up, we got Vivian Monsters Advocate. This card is amazing. Slam dunk first pick, amazing card. Not only does it get you value by casting creatures from the top of your library, it also makes you a 3/3 every turn that gets like reach counters if they have flyers, or trample if you're aggressive, or vigilance if you're trying to be like racing and things like that. But it also has like a -2 ability that you can get for free, like as a little bit of a bonus. Like you get to search your library, which is really powerful, especially if you're casting like a 6-drop. So I think Vivian's Monsters Advocate is amazing. If you go like on turn 5, Vivian +1, next turn -2, play a 6-drop, get a 5-drop from your deck, you're just going to win the game. So this card is amazing. Slam dunk first pick, great card. Next up, we are on to the gold cards already. Jeez. We are starting things off with Brokos, Apex of Forever. I guess the Brokos is broken. Oh, yes! That pun felt so good. That was a terrible pun. What have I done? What have I done? What have I become? Oh, yeah. But Brokos, Apex of Forever is fantastic. You can just cast it over and over and over. Your opponent has to constantly deal with a 6/6, and it's not even that hard because you can get the mutate ability like relatively simply. It's only 5 mana to mutate your 6/6 trample back over and over. Slam dunk first pick. Definitely splash this card. You will have the tools to splash this card in your like Sultai decks. Those color combinations are going to go to the late game. They're going to have tools to splash. They're going to have self-mill. If you're feeling super ambitious, you could even play it in like a green-blue deck that didn't have any like black mana or something like that. If you were just like super confident you could mill it and felt lucky. I don't recommend that, but it's definitely like you don't actually need all 3 colors to mutate it back, which is kind of funny. But definitely just take this card, play it. It's going to be really irritating to play against. And if you have a pacifism, try to save it for that Brokos if you do see it, because that way they can't keep getting it back. Next is Cheville, Bane of Monsters. I pointed this out when I first saw this card, but it's kind of messed up. Like Bane of Monsters, he's just killing their eggs. That's just so wrong on like a moral level. And also, like, why do we think he's cool just because he's killing the eggs? Like, he's not like, there's not like a slain monster behind him. That would be a very different story. It's just like, yeah, look at this guy, he's a human rogue, he's the Bane of Monsters because he goes into their nests when they're gone and kills all of the eggs. Like, the artwork doesn't match the description I have, or maybe it's supposed to be like, oh, he's the Bane of Monsters because he's immoral. I don't know, it just feels a little bit wrong to kill the eggs, but you know, that's just me. Anyway, Cheville, Bane of Monsters is definitely a great card. Like, his abilities are good. Death Touch is great in this format with big creatures. He's going to be able to put bounty counters on multiple things your opponents control, and then every removal spell becomes like a 2-for-1. When he trades off, it's a 2-for-1. He's overall just a great card, and one that I could see first picking, and I could even see just splashing it, even though it is a 2-drop. In the late game, it'll still be a pretty relevant ability and get you some value. So if I had like good tools to splash, I would consider splashing Cheville, even though it's at its best in a black-green deck where you can play it early and just start marking everything. I would consider splashing it if I was already considering. If I was already going to splash black, I might add Cheville to the splash pile. I probably wouldn't splash black just for Cheville. Next up is Death's Oasis. I'm not like, this one's like really confusing, so every time I see it, I have to reread it. The activated ability, not great. You don't really want to be sacrificing it. The triggered ability, like, you put the top 2, then you return a creature. I just don't think it's very good. I don't think you're going to have a full enough graveyard to consistently get value out of this, especially because it is 3 colors, so it's going to be harder to like put it in your deck. It's going to require some work to play, and then when you do play it, it's going to be like very finicky. So unless you're like a heavy black-green self-mill deck that splashes white for this card, I don't think you're going to want it. And I don't think it's going to be required a high pick because I don't think other decks are going to want this card. So I think it's probably playable and actually good in a dedicated self-mill black-green deck as a payoff, because you're going to always be able to get back like the highest possible converted mana cost to your hand, and it's going to be really irritating for your opponent. But I don't think it's like a super high pick, unless you're like unless you're trying to go deep, maybe. Next is Eerie Ultimatum. The ultimatums are probably just unplayable and limited for the most part. Because they're just so hard to cast. Like, if I'm a black-green deck, I have to get double white, which means I have to play, like, I guess if I have, like, that Rampant Growth, it'll work, but, like, I can't imagine first picking the card because it just requires so much. It means you have to be a base black deck, because there's no world where you can splash a triple color. You have to be a base black-white or a black-green deck, And if you're not black-green, then you're not going to be able to get the tools to splash white pretty effectively. And I just overall, like, sure, the effect is amazing if you have, like, a great, like, fully stocked graveyard in the late game, which this is going to come down in the late game because it's a 7-drop that's, like, impossible to cast. Overall, I think this is probably best avoided. It's probably just a trap, though it is going to be sweet when someone does pull this off, though not when they pull it off against you. You're just going to be like, well, what is life? But yeah, when someone plays one of the ultimatums against me, I'm just going to be like, well, good job, opponent. You really did it there. Because it just feels so bad. It's just so much value. Overall, I'm not going to think this is a high pick, though. It's just too constricting on the mana. Next up is Emergent Ultimatum. Again, too constricting on the mana. It's like, even if you're a blue-green deck, splashing the black is going to be difficult. And this one's not even like as powerful necessarily. Like, sure, you put them directly into play. But in limited, you're not going to have like Emeralds to put into play. You're going to have like 6 drops. So you're going to be spending 7 mana to get 2 6-drops, which is good, but this is such a prohibitive cost. Your opponent they have to be monocolored 6-drops, so you can't even get your like Brocos and stuff like that. Like if you got Brocos and Emergent Ultimatum, that'd be hilarious. It's actually the perfect card to get with Emergent Ultimatum, because if it goes to the graveyard, you can get it back. Man, Brocos and Emergent Ultimatum combo! Yeah, it's not going to be a great card. Again, the mana cost is just too constricting. Yeah, you get 3 big cards, you get 2 of them. A lot of the time, you're not even going to have that many expensive cards. Like, sure, if you get like your 11/11 trample and your 8/8 death touch, you're going to feel like a genius. But your opponent, you're not going to have like infinite super expensive cards in your deck. So you're probably going to get like 2 big creatures that cost more than 6, which is going to be great, but not really going to be worth the cost of not being able to cast this 90% of the time. Next up, we have Frontline Philidor. This is one of the best payoffs of being a white-green deck. White-green doesn't really get a ton of uncommons. I think they tried to not give a ton of uncommons to the allied color pairs, is what I read, which is kind of interesting. But Frontline Philidor is going to be fantastic because there is a decent amount of vigilance, and the way it works is you attack with all your vigilance creatures, and then you tap all your vigilance creatures, and all of your opponent's creatures get tapped. That's the beauty of vigilance, is you can do this after you've attacked. So I think Frontline Philidor is going to be great for that reason, and definitely an early pick that you can build around. So I'm pretty excited to play with it, I think. Next up is General Kudrow of Dranith. Definitely going to be a good payoff for a humans deck, giving them all +1/+1. You definitely want other humans in your deck before you take General Kudrow, so I don't think he's he's probably worth first picking and building around, because it does look like there's enough human synergy to make it worth it. But if you're like considering moving into white-black in like pack 2 for a General Kudrow, it's going to be harder to get there on humans, so keep that in mind. But in a humans deck, the sacrifice 2 humans ability to kill a creature is really good, because a lot of the times you're going to get those 1/1 humans from like random things, and you're going to really want to kill your opponent's big creature, and that's a nice upside. The +1/+1 is nice. It's not like the best rare ever, but it's definitely going to be super powerful, and I could see first picking it, even though it is a gold card. I think there are some monocolored like removal spells that I would definitely just take over this early in a draft, because they're way more likely to make my deck. But General Kudrow is definitely a sweet build around that is going to be fun when it works out, and definitely worth an early pick a lot of the time. Next up is Genesis Ultimatum. Again, it's so expensive and hard to cast. Though I will say, the ultimatums that have green in them are more likely to be playable, because if you do have fixing and you like open this in pack 3, there are scenarios where you can get there. Like, there is a lot of fixing in green, and there's a lot of like fixing in general. So the ones that have green in them, I think, are way more playable than the ones that don't. But I think this one is definitely like one of the like weaker ones in terms of power level. Like, how many times have you looked at the top 5 cards of your library and seen like 2 lands, a couple of instants, and like 1 creature? Like, sure, you draw 5, but it's like 7 mana, and there's like a 6 mana draw 4 in blue. So like, you're getting like similar value. And I think Genesis Ultimatum, while it is a fun card, is not really going to be the best splash. Again, I do want to emphasize, for all the other ones I've talked about, if it does have green in its cost, it's going to be more splashable. But you're going to need a very particular deck, and I don't think it's really a high first pick. More like, if I already am green with a bunch of fixing, I'll be really happy to see these later on, because nobody else can play them, so you're going to get past those ultimatums. Next up is Illumina, Apex of Wishes. Again, the Apexes are other cards that I'm going to have to like read again, because I get them confused with each other. This is the Flying Trampler one that you get to get an online permanent card onto the battlefield or into your hand. Yeah, this card is fantastic. Again, it's expensive to mutate, but you can also just play it as a 5-mana 6/6 Flying Trample, which is just great on its own. And then it has the upside of, if you mutate it, you get card advantage, and you get to attack with it immediately a lot of the time. So I think Illumina Apex of Wishes definitely one that you're going to want to be splashing a lot of the time, and it actually is a great splash because if you are like playing this in a blue-green deck, then you can, even if you're missing on your red source, you can still mutate it. So you don't even have to be splashing it. You can just actually just play this in a blue-red deck, a green deck, and just only ever mutate it. So definitely that type of thing is very relevant. It doesn't have to require you to take fixing. So Illumina is just a slam dunk first pick pretty much every time. Next is Inspired Ultimatum. This one doesn't have green in its cost, but it's arguably like one of the best ones in terms of effect. Like you kill a creature, draw 5 cards, which is just really good, and you gain 5 life to help you survive until you can spend those cards. I don't think you're ever really going to be able to play this one though, because it doesn't have green, so you're not going to have the fixing you need to play it, but definitely a sweet card though, one that you're probably never going to play in limited. Next is Cannonbounder Prodigy. It's a 2-drop. It's a 2-mana 2/2 that is a human, which means you're not going to be able to mutate onto it. Blue-green is a color that is heavy on mutate, so not being able to mutate is a downside. But it does work well with the mana rocks. It works well with the creature in green that taps for mana, and you can use its ability. I mean, that creature only taps to cast creatures, but and then it does have an activated ability in the late game that is pretty good, though. Especially in a deck that's going to have big creatures like Greater Sandworms and things like that. But I think Cannon's probably not like an insanely high pick. I would take most of the premium removal over him because while it is nice in the late game, it's a gold card. Its ability isn't super relevant and limited. I would actually take a lot of the just common, like solid removal over him as well. The 7-mana ability is super expensive. So while a sweet card, it's more of like a mid-level pick once you're already in a Simic deck and you're like, it'll be nice to have Cannon, but I don't think it's a super high priority ever. Next up is Labyrinth Raptor. This card is a pretty high priority, I think. It actually just kind of like really wrecks your opponent when you have menace creatures. Like it makes all of your menace creatures like kill both creatures when they attack. And sometimes if you have like a combat trick, you can like attack with your menace creatures and your opponent double blocks it. You kill the bigger creature, they sacrifice the smaller one, and you just crush them. You can buff up your menace creatures, and there is more menace running around because there are creatures that have the ability to choose to get the menace keyword. There are cards that give the menace keyword, like the best black common or one of the best black commons. I haven't actually ranked the commons yet, but the removal spell in black will put a menace counter on a creature, and that's what a card you're going to want to play. So I think Labyrinth Raptor does suffer from the fact that it's a gold card, does suffer from the fact that it's narrow, but it's probably going to be like a higher pick than like the Drannith type card. Not Drannith, what was his name? Cannonbounder Prodigy. Why did I say Drannith? Yeah, because Drannith is location. But yeah, it's going to be a higher pick than the Cannon type card, even though it's like the same, like, it's like a gold card that costs 2. I think this is the type of card that if I took this like third after taking a red card and a black, if I took like a black card and a black card, I'd take Labyrinth Raptor third and be pretty happy about it because I think it's a very build-aroundable type card and it's a very powerful card even on its own. So Labyrinth Raptor definitely gets a solid grade from me and I'm pretty happy with it. I think it's a cool design as well. Narset of the Ancient Way is our next card. I have a soft spot for Narset because this was the first Planeswalker I ever opened. Narset Enlightened Master, I believe, whichever one was in Dragons of Tarkir. But Narset of the Ancient Way, not going to be like as I have to read the card again. I forgot what the -2 did. I like know that the like +1 was ability that I wasn't super happy to be playing. Like for 4 mana, you want your +2 to do more than just add a mana. Especially because the mana can't even be used for everything. The -2, draw a card, discard. Yeah, the thing with the -2 is you're not going to get to use it very much because if you -2 a lot of the time, Narset will just die before, like she'll maybe get to -2 twice in a game. And like a lot of the time when you loot, you want to be getting rid of lands instead of spells. Getting rid of spells is going to feel really bad. And then it's very inflexible. So I just don't think Narset's going to be good. It's a card that you would have to splash anyway. So pretty much like don't play Narset. It's kind of a trap in limited. We'll see what it does in Constructed, but in limited, not really going to be super powerful. Next up is Nethroi, Apex of Death. Again, this is a card that you don't have to like splash. You can just cast it only for its mutate cost in your like white-black or your green-black deck. But if you are going to be casting it as a 5-mana 5/5 Death Touch Lifelink, it's probably worth it. So I would consider splashing the color if you were going to be playing like a green-black deck. That being said, you don't need to. And when you mutate it, you just get like an insane amount of value. So this card's going to be a fantastic early pick. Really easy to get into get into a lot of decks. It can be in 2 different other color combinations, or you can play it within an Abzan deck. And it's just a massive Death Touch Lifelink creature that gets you back a ton of value. Oh, they go straight to the battlefield too. Yeah, this card is absolutely absurd. For some reason, I thought they went to the hand because that would be like a little bit more reasonable, but they just go straight to the battlefield. So yeah, unreal card. And you can even like do the trick where you cycle a big creature and then you get your Nethroi out and you get back that big creature. And oh my gosh, I just realized it's whenever this creature mutates. Oh my gosh. So like, oh my gosh. So if you play this in like a green-black deck, you just have like a fully stocked graveyard, and then you're just mutating constantly. Like you mutate onto this once when it comes into play, and then you mutate onto it again, and you just get back another 10 converted mana cost. Oh my gosh, this card is so broken. Holy smokes. Well, yeah, that's kind of my reaction to reading the card. Yeah, I started off like, wait, what? Wait, what? Wait, what? Yeah, that card is insane. Definitely first pick that card if you see it, and make sure it gets in your deck because it's amazing. Holy smokes. Yeah, I totally forgot that you can mutate onto the same creature multiple times, and then just hit me like, boom, like, holy, jeez, that's amazing. Next up is Offspring's Revenge. I think this card's a really cool design. I love the flavor. I love the fact that it's like, the artwork kind of makes sense with it. It's kind of sad. It reminds me of like The Land Before Time, where Littlefoot's mom dies. Spoiler alert. I guess I should have said spoiler alert before. I said that, but yeah, that was very sad when that happened, so yeah. But this kind of reminds me of that, like the Offspring, all they found in the Hunter's camp were tiny paw prints and a lot of blood. Like, geez, that's gruesome flavor text. The artwork is so sad. But yeah, you pretty much, it's very, like, you'll want to, like, it's not a green card, so it's going to be harder to splash, but if you do splash it, it's going to be really sweet because you can have, like, some decent self-mill in black, and then, like, you get the token that's a copy of creatures. It's probably not going to be very good in limited, but I love the flavor of the card. It's not going to be great in limited just because it's going to be pretty hard to stock your graveyard as well in like a black-white deck that's splashing red. It's going to be harder to have a ton of like creatures that you want as 1/1s, and you're not going to have as many good abilities. But it's a sweet card. I hope it sees play in Constructed because it's got great flavor, and I really love the design. This is the type of card that the design really appeals to me, and I'm going to try my best to play it, even if it's not its best, because it seems like a sweet card to try and build around. Next up is Quartzwood Crasher. This one, simple, effective, brutal, crushes your opponent. It's a 5-mana 6/6 trample. Already great. It is a gold card, but I still think it's worth an early pick because whenever it hits your opponent, you get however like big of a creature based on the trample it is. So like if you hit your opponent with this card and they can't block or they aren't willing to chump, you just get another 6/6 trampler, which is amazing. Keep in mind if you do have like multiple tramplers, the creature you get is just going to be bigger. You're not going to get like multiple 6/6s if you have two 6/6 tramplers. You're going to get a 12/12. So you win some, you lose some. I think it'd probably be better to get two 6/6s, but it's still going to be fantastic to get a 12/12. And there is a decent amount of trample running around, especially in red-green. Quartzwood Crashers are slam dunk, like really early pick, and it's going to be a great card. Next up, I would be happy to first pick that card. Next up is Riel the Everwise. This card is super sweet. Not only does it work with cycling, which is great, so you're going to draw an extra card when you cycle the first time on each turn, so you can cycle on your turn and your opponent's turn to get like those double card value. There are some cards like Cathartic Reunion that like discard 2 cards to draw 3, and then you're going to get to draw like 7 cards. Cathartic Reunion becomes a discard 2, draw 7. Like, are you? I know it's draw 5. I did horrible math there. Yeah, it's draw 5. And all of your cycling cards become like pay 1 mana, discard this, draw 2, which is really nice. I don't know where I got 7 for Cathartic Reunion, but draw 5 is still amazing. So Riel the Everwise, I'm going to be taking this early, playing around it. I think there's a ton of discard in the set with just cycling and Cathartic Reunions and lootings and stuff like that. And I think it's going to be a great card, and I think it's definitely going to be an early pick, and especially because there is so much cycling in the set. So Riel the Everwise is going to be a fantastic addition to your decks, and it's going to be like when you play this on. And it's also going to grow to be a big creature, but you're just pretty much playing it for the passive ability of drawing you like 4 or 5 extra cards for only 3 mana over the course of the game. Next up is Ruinous Ultimatum. Again, it's not a green one, so it's going to be really hard to cast. It is a fantastic effect, though, so if you ever do cast this, send me a screenshot. It's going to be amazing. Next up is Skycat Sovereign. It really pays you off for having other flyers. It's a great card to mutate onto because it has flying itself and it's cheap, so you go like turn 2 play this, and then you mutate another creature onto it, and all of a sudden you've got a massive mutate creature. There's not as many big mutate creatures outside of like, there's like a 4/4 I think in white that you can mutate onto this. It like gains you some life, but there's not gonna be like, it's not like a green deck where you can mutate on like a 5/5 or a 6/6. creature, but Skycat Sovereign is going to be great even on its own. You can just making 1/1 white cat bird creatures is going to be great for 4 mana as an extra ability, and it grows the Skycat Sovereign at the same time. I'm really excited to play with this card, though. I think I'd still take a lot of premium removal over it in like the first pack because it is a gold card and it is kind of expensive to use its stuff. It's still going to be a great card, though. I still think it's a good card. Next up is Sliver Wisp. I'm not sure how many cards actually have flash. Like, I know there's a couple, like, there's a 6-drop in black that's like a 5/2 that gives a creature -2/2. There's like the uncommon, like this blue-black that's just a human rogue. But I'm not sure how many things have flash, and there's the rare, there's the Dirge Bat. These are just like top of my head cards, but there's quite a few cards. I'm sure there's a few cards that have flash in the set. And this is just a 3-mana 3/2 that's kind of hard to cast on its own. But if you have like 5 flash cards or like even 4 flash cards, this card's going to be great. I just don't think it's worth an early pick because it is a gold card. It only goes into one deck really, and even in that deck, I don't think it's going to be like game ending when you play this card. It's just going to be good. So I think Slither Wisp is probably going to be fantastic if you have it in a blue-black deck because you're probably going to have some flash spells there. But I don't think it's going to be like an insanely high pick because it is so difficult on the mana. Next up is Snapdax, Apex of the Hunt. This card's amazing. You mutate it, you kill their creature. It's now a double strike creature. So if you mutate onto a creature that was already bigger, now you just give it double strike. You can also, again, play this in like a white-black deck, a white-red deck. You don't have to play this in Mardu, which is a fantastic thing to know. Like, you don't have to be a 3-color deck to play this card. You can just take it, and then you just play it in like your white-red deck. And it's going to be great, because it's a double striker. It gives your creature double strike when the turn it comes into play. Like, you hit them for 6. On turn 5, you play this, kill their best creature, and hit them for 6 damage with your double striker. So, Snapdax is amazing. Great first pick, and I'll be happy to play it. It is not as good as Nethroi, I don't think, but thinking about it, Nethroi is just, like, actually disgusting. Like, maybe I'm imagining how big my graveyard's going to be, but even if I just have, like, 3 creatures in there, it's by turn 7. That's not unreasonable. Yeah. Song of Creation is next. I don't think it's very good. It's kind of tricky to get to go, but I think it's going to be a card you can play. Like, there are going to be situations where you have a blue-green deck that just has no card draw. So you'll splash your Song of Creation, and then you'll like play it once your hand is empty and you have no more things to play. And when your hand is empty and you play Song of Creation, all of a sudden you're like on your draw step. If you draw a spell, you can start like chaining things together, and it sounds like super fun. I don't think it's a high pick. I think it's like a kind of like the type of card that you don't need to prioritize ever because nobody else wants it. It's not worth splashing really unless you're like a blue-green deck that again doesn't really have any late game engines. But then Song of Creation could really kind of pull its own. So I think it's going to be like a card you can get super late in the draft. You don't have to prioritize picking it really ever, but it is going to be sweet when it does work out. And yeah, I don't think most decks are going to want to splash though. You're not going to want to splash this outside of like blue-green. I don't think green-red's probably going to be too aggressive to want this type of card. Next up is Titan's Nest. This card is like Delve the card. It reminds me a lot of Sultai Ascendancy from Khans of Tarkir. I don't know why. I guess it's because it has the Sultai cost. But basically, it makes all of your cards cost cheaper. And which is like, oh, without X. I thought it said with X for a second, and I was like, wait, I misread this card vastly. But basically, it lets you scry every turn, and you can actually surveil every turn, I think is the more technical term. And then it lets you cast your cards for cheaper. I think it's not going to be great in limited. Your graveyard's not going to be generally full enough, and it is a 4-mana investment, but it could definitely see some cool play in Constructed for what that's worth. I just don't think it's going to be worth it in limited, though. Best avoid this card. Next up is Adrock, Apex of Thunder. Again, I will say, the mutate cost, all you have to be is red, white, or red, blue. You don't have to be, I think I put a pause in the wrong spot. All you have to be is red, white, or red, blue. You don't have to be a red, white, blue deck to play this card. Though it's nice to have the option of casting it as just a 3/3 flying first strike, because sometimes with all of the cards, it's nice to have the actual option of casting it because you don't want to be like, oh, I don't have another creature in play, I can't play this. But I still think it's going to be good without that. And when you mutate it, you can cast a non-creature spell that's cheap from your graveyard, which is pretty nice. So for 4 mana, you get this guy, and you get a 3/3. And flying and first strike are two of the better abilities to have with mutate, because then if you ever make the creature bigger, it's pretty much unblockable ever, because you now have a massive flying first striker. I mean, 3/3 is already pretty big. So I think Adrock, again, early pick. Not as good as some of the other Apexes, because sometimes you're not going to have cheap non-creature spells in your graveyard, but still going to be a great card, and I'm pretty excited to play it. Next up is Whirlwind of Thought. This card is amazing. I actually would splash this card in like a Jeskai deck. I think I've been probably giving the impression that it's hard to splash outside of green decks. That was mostly because the ultimatums require double of the color to splash, which I think is really hard. But in a lot of the decks, you can still splash this card. The cards, it's just a little bit more tricky because you're going to have to rely on gain lands or the uncommon mana rocks or things like that, or evolving wilds. So it's definitely still feasible to splash in these decks. So I don't want to give the impression that it's impossible to splash in like a Jeskai card, because this card is definitely splashable. When I take this card early, which I will be doing, I'm going to be splashing it, and it's going to be fantastic because they're like, even if you have like, it's not that hard to get a deck with like 8 non-creature spells in it, and drawing a card every time you cast one is super powerful, and this card is going to be super sweet to play. I think it's going to be worth an early pick, worth building around, because it's just an excellent control finisher for a deck, and yeah, I think it's going to be great. Even though it might be a gamble to say it's going to be great, but I think it's probably going to be quite powerful, and definitely a card you can build around, because it looks like there's a lot of great instants and sorceries running around, even though it could be a little bit slow. So maybe I'm just like idealizing it, but I think it's going to be a fun card at the very least. So on second evaluation, don't prioritize this card super early in the draft. Like, probably take a good removal spell over this is a responsible pick, but I'll probably just take the Whirlwind of Thought because it's a sweet card. Yeah, it's going to be very cool. Next up, we are getting to some of the companions, I guess, in a slight moment. We next have Winota, Joiner of Forces. Whenever a non-human attacks you, creature you control attacks. So you need a non-human. You look at the top 6 and you put a human on the battlefield, tapped and attacking, and they get seen indestructible. Yeah. This card is great. You can play this immediately. Like on turn 4, you play this, attack with a non-human, and then you get a human. So like, you want to have a nice mix of humans and non-humans in your deck, especially non-humans that cost less than 4, which you're going to be wanting anyway, because then you can mutate onto them on turn 4 and things like that. And then Winota just gets you a bunch of value. So this is a great first pick. Even though it is color committal, you can even splash this in your decks, and like your white-green deck might splash this type of card. Your white-black deck might splash this type of card. And Winota is going to be a fantastic card. I really like the flavor. I really like the card, and definitely a great first pick. Next is Fiend Artisan. Not a huge fan of this card. I think the ability is too expensive to be great. The passive ability, where it gets +1/+1, is fine, especially if you're going to mutate onto the Fiend Artisan. It's also like relatively flexible, so like, I could definitely see it being good in a green-black deck. Like, I could see it being like a 4/4 for 2 mana, which is nice. And then if you mutate onto it, the creature gets +3/+3 as well, which is also nice. But I just don't think it's going to be like an absurd rare. Like, it'll be a solid card that you probably will take relatively highly, but I don't think you're going to take it over good removal spells, which is kind of like a reasonable threshold. And even some of the better mutate creatures, I'd definitely take them over this, or a lot of the better mutate creatures, I'd just take over this. Next up is Gyruda, Doom of Depths. This card is fantastic. And keep in mind, I'm saying that it's fantastic even without Companion mattering at all. The way Companion works, for those that don't know, is if you meet the Companion restriction, you can put it in your sideboard, and then you can cast it once per game from your sideboard, as long as you tell your opponent beforehand that that's what you're doing. And putting, like, there's a lot of big creatures in the set, like especially like big cycling creatures, things like that. And if you like play Gyruda and like mill like the 8-drop that has like an 8 mana 8/8 Death Touch, things like that, you just win the game. If you mill like, even if you mill like a 4-drop, you've gotten like 10 mana worth of cards, and you always know that you're going to be able to cast this on turn 6. So one thing I heard LSV say that was really cool and interesting was, if you are going for the Companion part of this, you can play like 19 lands in your deck, or 20 lands in your deck even, because you know you're going to always have a 6-drop on turn 6, so you can just afford to get that consistency from your mana, which is really an interesting thing to think about. I think most of the time you're just going to put this in your main deck, and it's going to be fantastic when you do draw it, because only putting even converted mana cost is a huge cost, but it's going to be great. You mill, like, you have 8 chances to hit something big, or even something reasonable sized, and most of the time you're going to get something. So I think Gyruda is a fantastic card, and it's a hybrid card, so you can play it in blue or black or blue-black, so it's going to be really easy to get this into your deck, even easier than if it was just 4 blue-blue or something like that. So Gyruda, fantastic card, definitely first pick those types of things. Next up, we have Jegantha the Wellspring. I think this ability is going to be hard to enable, or at least relatively difficult, because there are just some cards that are like hybrid mana that you're going to want to play, like the 2 green-red hybrid type uncommon. You're going to want to play in your green-red decks or your green decks. Jegantha can go in a green deck or a red deck, or like, so that makes it very flexible. But I think a lot of the time you're not going to be able to enable this. Playing it as a 5-mana 5/5 with the ability to tap for a couple mana is relatively solid. But I don't think it's going to be like an insane card. I definitely think it'll be sweet to try and draft this early and build around it. So I think it's like probably reasonably high pick. I think you'd probably be best served taking the good removal spells over this, but if you can build around it, it can actually be a really powerful enabler for a deck that's splashing a bunch of good cards. Keep in mind though that your opponent will kind of know that you're splashing a bunch of good cards if you're just playing a bunch of random lands and then play Gigantic, and so they'll probably just kill it, but at least you have that extra resource that they have to kill. So I think Gigantha is probably going to be a good card in the format, but it's not going to be like you'll take the good removal over it, but you'll probably take this over a lot of the other things just because it is really powerful if you can enable it, and it's not like impossible to enable this as a companion. It's just relatively difficult, and you'll have to make some sacrifices, but I think the sacrifices are probably going to be worth it a lot of the time to get a free 5/5, or free. You get it in your hand for free. Next up is Kafira, the Orphan Guard. I think this card is going to be solid, but I think a lot of the time you're going to be having to play it in your main deck rather than in your sideboard, because even though there are a lot of cats, elementals, nightmares, dinosaurs, and beasts, I think you're going to want to be playing some humans in your green-white decks, because a lot of the best white creatures are humans. I just can't imagine like skipping out on all of those. It's really hard to build such a constraining deck. Obviously this thing is going to be much better in constructed than limited, but I think getting a free 3-mana 3/2, while nice, is probably not worth the cost of making your creature base substantially worse. So there are going to be some dream scenarios where you just get to like roll through the draft and don't ever see a human that's like significantly better than the other cards you'd be taking, but like there are a lot of like potential downsides. So I think Kafira is like a good card. You'll take it like relatively early just because there are a lot of creatures it buffs. So just as a card in your main deck, it's going to be good, but I don't think it's going to be a companion as often as you think. Next up is Keruga, the Macro Sage. I actually really like this card as a main deck option. Like a 5-mana 5/4 that draws you 2 cards potentially, or even if it just draws you 1 card, it's going to be great. You're not going to want to play this as your companion because in limited, you really need to have 2 drops. And especially in a deck that has Mutate, you're going to want to make sure you have a lot of cards that cost less than 4, because 4 and sometimes even 3 are the best like times to mutate. And so you're going to want to have like cheaper cards so you can mutate onto them. But I do think that Keruga is going to be a sweet main deck option, and it's blue-green hybrid, so you can play it in a lot of your decks. So I think it's going to be a very early pick and a great card as a main deck option. Don't try to build around it because you'll just lose a lot of games to an aggressive deck curving out on you. Next up is Luris of the Dream Den. Again, this is more of a main deck option. In limited, you're not going to be able to function if you don't have any cards in your deck that cost more than 2. Like, you also just can't build a deck where your permanents cost, like, all cost 2 or less. So this is just only a main deck option, but it is flexible as a white-black hybrid card, and there are going to be a lot of cards you can get back from your graveyard, so I think Luris is going to be an early pick, but you're never going to get the companion triggered in limited. Next is Lutri, the Spell Chaser. Again, early pick, flexible, goes in red or blue. It's just a free creature, so you're just going to want to play this, and you're going to actually probably be able to get the Singleton enabled like pretty much every time, so Lutri is definitely an early pick and a really sweet card as well. Keep in mind, though, it is banned in Commander and Brawl, so don't think, oh, this card is sweet, I'm going to take it for my Commander deck, because you won't be able to play it. Next up is Obosh, the Prey Piercer. Obosh, again, you're not going to want to build a deck that only has odd converted mana costs, but because you need 2 drops in your limited decks, and you're not going to get enough 1 drops to cover that. It's just a very flexible card, and it does count itself, so it's going to be able to deal like 6 damage on its own, like when it attacks and does damage and things like that. So it's like a 5-mana 6/5. But I still don't think it's like an insane card. Like 5-mana 6/5, hybrid mana, like not an insanely high pick. I would take a lot of the better commons and uncommons over it. Next up is Maury the Collector. It's a 4-mana 4/5 with hybrid mana, so again, can't ever be too bad. You can also make stuff cheaper, so I think it's mostly just a mainland. It is mostly just a main deckable card for your green-black deck that's going to be pretty good, because you can make your other stuff cost cheaper, depending on what you need. So maybe you have a good 6-drop in your hand, so you want to curve into that a little bit sooner, things of that nature. And yeah, you're never going to get this as a companion because you're never going to have like all creatures. Next up is Aeon Sky Nomad. This is also going to be really tricky because 20 cards is way, way over the top. Like that, like if you're running a bigger limited deck, you're generally going to be like running like 50 cards, if that. If you're running like a really weird like green-black like very specific deck in Theros Beyond Death, but 60 cards is a lot. That being said, 60 cards means you'll always have your 4/5 flyer on turn 5, and a 4/5 flyer is pretty good on turn 5. It's like a little bit bigger than you'd expect a lot of the time. It can be played in a white deck or a blue deck, and you can flicker a bunch of cards, which is kind of some nice value. That being said, I think Yorion is probably just going to be best as a main deck card, and it's going to be a really good main deck card. So you're going to still take this very early, still play this every time pretty much, but you're just not going to be playing it with its companion ability. Next up is Sirte the Dawnwalker, the Dawnwaker. Sirte the Dawnwaker, one thing that it works with is cycling, so keep that in mind for your white-red cycling decks. It's also just a very flexible card. You're not going to be able to use the companion ever in Limited, but the card itself is very flexible, very powerful, so you're just still going to take this early and play it pretty much in pretty much every deck, because it makes your cycling cost less, and it does make it so stuff can't block, which is really nice. So, and it's a 3-mana 3/3. The hybrid mana means you're always going to get to play it, so it's definitely worth an early pick. Though again, I think I would probably take this one over the early removal, over all but the very best of removal spells, probably. Definitely a great card. And next up, we have only a few more cards to go. We have Crystalline Giant. I misread this card the first time when I read choose a kind of counter. I didn't see the at random part, so I was like, well, you choose Hexproof, then Death Touch, then First Strike, and the card is just unbeatable. But I still think the card's going to be amazing. It's very flexible. It's going to become very powerful as the game goes on, and it's a 3-mana 3/3 that's colorless, so you're always going to get to play this, and you can even mutate onto it, which is amazing. So Crystalline Giant, amazing first pick, and it works super well with mutating onto it. So keep that in mind, because it's going to have all these keywords, so it's going to be great. Next up is the Ozolith. This is another sweet card. It lets you, it's very cheap to enable, and it works really well with the keyword counters. I don't know how many keyword counter enablers I'd want before I played the Ozolith, because again, if you top deck this in the late game and you have all your creatures have already died, it doesn't really do much. Or if you play it early in the game before you've kind of set up your board, it doesn't really do a ton. But I think the Ozolith, keywords can be worth mana, can be worth cards. You would sometimes, if there was a card that gave a creature lifelink and flying, there would be certain cases where you would want that type of card. So if you have enough keywords, I could see playing the Ozolith, but most of the time you're not going to prioritize this card because you're not going to get the keyword counter density to make this card worth it, though it is a very sweet card. Next up is a Bonder's Enclave. This is a colorless land that you're always going to want to play because there are going to be high-powered creatures in most decks thanks to Mutate making the creatures relatively big, and it's a relatively low cost to put this in your deck. I would probably tend to play this as my 18th land because it kind of functions as a spell and makes it less likely that you'll mana screw, while also giving you a nice mana sink, so you can actually use Bonder's Enclave and then have lands to cast your spells that you'll draw off of it. And it also doesn't hurt your colors, your ability to tap for different colors when you have Bonder's Enclave if you play it as your 18th land. But I still think the card is great and probably worth a high pick because I think you're going to be able to have high-powered creatures in the set, and you're going to be able to get good value out of Bonder's Enclave if the board stalls out. Though, yeah, I think it's not going to be a card you take over premium removal because there are not as many games go to this type of late game as you'd think, but it is super effective to have a land slot win you the late game in those situations. So I think it is still a high pick, but not over the best of the best. Next up, we have the Cycling Tri-Lands. These cards are all going to be great if you're looking to splash. Even without looking to splash, having a land that can cycle for 3 is going to be really good because it means in the late game, it means you can play an extra land, but in the late game, you're going to be able to get rid of your land. I think cycling 3 is a big cost because you're not going to generally be able to play a lot of your spells after you cycle them. If you have 7 mana in play and you cycle this, you cut off a huge portion of the spells you could draw, or I guess you cut off a decent portion, or if you have 6 lands in play, things like that. But I think the cards are still going to be good. They're going to be high picks. They fix your mana and they cycle, and they're going to be more effective than you think because the ability to cycle them in the late game is really nice. So those are Indatha Triumph, Ketria Triumph, Rogrin Triumph, Savai Triumph, and Zagoth Triumph. That is all of the rares and mythics in the set. I really do hope you enjoyed this video. If you did make it all the way till the end, in the comment section down below, leave 68 up, hashtag 68 up, 68 down, because there are 68 rares and mythics in the set, so leave that in the comment section down below to let me know you made it all the way till the end of the video. Remember to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment if you have any questions or feedback, and I will talk to you in my next video.